All right, Pat, we're here. This is the big one. Episode 9 of Season 1, entitled Baelor. This is the big one. This is the first episode that made waves on the internet back in the day when it originally came out, famously for this being the episode that contains Ned Stark's death. Everyone was shocked. They're like, no way. There's no way that he could possibly actually die, right? There's totally going to be a surprise thing, a surprise deus ex machina that comes in and saves him last minute. And no, that was unfortunately not the case. That was TV audience's first rude awakening to what book readers had already known for about 10 to 20 years at that point. Pat, what are your thoughts before we actually get into this episode?
You know, Dom, it's I pretty much watched the Mets game earlier today, and you know, they lost the game pretty much just like Ned Stark loses the Game of Thrones. So unfortunately, it wasn't their day.
Yes, it was not his day. Completely inexperienced and unfortunately in way over their heads, I feel like is the common metaphor across the board. All of that and more on tonight's episode of Talkin Thrones. Stay tuned. All right, Pat, episode 9. We made it. One episode left, and then we'll have completed an entire season of this show as far as recaps go, man. Just like, before we get into it, like, what are your thoughts just kind of on this journey so far on season 1 of Game of Thrones? Did it hold up to the way that you remembered it? Was it better? Was it worse? Like, talk to me as far as that goes.
You know, I don't know. We had a lot of people in our comments during these live streams, you know, essentially tell us like they really loved season 1. But, you know, I think for me, it's still pretty rocky. Like, it's a lot of good content, a lot of good sort of weaving of the storylines and setup. But ultimately, you know, I think it sort of, you know, doesn't quite, you know, it's not a perfect season. It doesn't come together 100%. You know, it's one of those things where, like, when this episode happens and Ned Stark sort of gets executed, you're basically like, oh man, I'm all in. This is a really big shocker. And then you go back to the next episode, episode 10, and you have, you know, some wrap up and set up for the next season. And I think that's pretty much where Game of Thrones gets its, you know, basically formula from. The penultimate episode is always sort of something big typically. And then that last episode is sort of a cool down episode, the setting up the next season. And then I think the next season always hits the ground running.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. It's funny because I remember we talked kind of way back in the first couple episodes when this aired about kind of how Game of Thrones kind of changed the formula of traditional television, where the whole thing about television for the longest time is that you could still get something from the individual episodes while at the same time kind of being able to factor them into the greater whole. But you could still like kind of tune in at any point and not really miss anything, right? And Game of Thrones, even more so than any other shows, that any other groundbreaking shows that came before that, like The Sopranos or Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones was one of those shows where it's like, no, if you try to enter this at like some random point, you're going to be lost, right? The whole thing about season 1 is that I'm kind of with you as far as that goes, right? Obviously, I have a strong attachment to it because I love the first book that it's based off of, obviously entitled The Game of Thrones. But the whole thing to me about the first season is it's an important season, certainly. It sets up a lot of threads that are obviously played out as we see in the next couple of seasons. But overall, I think what this kind of past rewatch showed me is that it's very different when you're binging it all at once. Like, and I remember I would knock out like an entire season in a day when I was binging the show, as opposed to watching it week to week. Like, I can kind of understand now as far as the whole it being kind of a little bit of a more of a slow burn, and then the ending almost feels like this quite literal gotcha moment, right? It sucks because I don't think this series ever intended to be all about shock value, but the problem is both just because of the trajectory of the seasons and also just kind of, especially in the earlier couple seasons, their budget limitations, it becomes very, very obvious that they kind of have to rely on the shocker moments in order to kind of clinch you, you know? And even though Ned Stark's death is a momentous occasion and a really interesting story turn, the problem is that ultimately, I think it's, I previously said this about the Red Wedding, but I think it starts here where this sets this really ugly precedent that we're going to get into as we continue to cover the show, right? Obviously, that's kind of the whole point of this podcast is we're trying to answer the question, what went wrong with Game of Thrones? And I think our examination of this past season has shown us that the problems kind of started here, you know? There's a lot of teleporting. There's a lot of time jumping without us even realizing it. A lot of the deaths come off as like really big shocker moments, but the thing that I feel like I took away the most from the deaths is I think with the exception of Ned Stark's I'll throw Viserys and Khal Drogo in there as well, not a lot of the deaths had a lot of emotional impact for me. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Khal Drogo, and I'm just going to say this, like, we're still, you know, moving that storyline forward of his death. Like, pretty much what we see this episode is the wound is more infected. He's falling off his horse. The Horde doesn't really, you know, want to back him anymore. They're already starting to look beyond Khal Drogo and Khaleesi, and you know it's the whole sort of culture in you know the Horde. It's essentially we follow the strong, and if you're falling off your horse, you're not going to be leading the pack anytime soon. And so I think you know his death. It actually is very big, you know, because it's like she started the season at the bottom of the barrel being like, you know, pretty much, well, 100% sexually assaulted by this marriage, you know, being sold into it. And, you know, she basically grew into power, grew into her character as the queen of this horde and, you know, embodied this power. And now with his death, she's going to lose it and basically be starting
right
all
back to
over
square
again,
one.
You know, and
right back to square one.
But this time, you know, she'll have three little, you know, companions that will help her through this rebuilding phase of her journey.
Yes, indeed. I want to save that for the next episode. But the thing that I like about this episode in particular, right, Baelor, this is a precedent that kind of existed long before Game of Thrones came around. This is kind of a precedent that HBO did, I feel like, for all of their shows, starting way back with The Sopranos, where the penultimate episode would have this really big shocker and twist, and it would kind of set you up for the finale, right? The difference being, though, is that I feel like with The Sopranos did right that Game of Thrones did wrong, is that with The Sopranos, the penultimate episode would shock you in a way that would shock you in a way in which you wouldn't see the finale coming, and then when the finale came and wrapped everything up so perfectly in like ways that you weren't expecting, it kind of worked. It didn't feel like it was just tiding you over for the next season, right? With Game of Thrones, that's not the case, because it feels like every single penultimate episode was something huge and grandiose, right? Ned Stark's death, Blackwater, the Red Wedding, the Battle of the Wall, the Dragon Pit, you know, Battle of the Bastards, going all the way up to the bells in the final season. And then the last episode was always kind of underwhelming. You know, it's just kind of rinse, repeat, reset for the next season. And some of them were definitely better than others. For me, the big ones that I remember really liking as far as final episodes go, I really dug the season 4 finale. I love the season 6 finale because Winds of Winter, I think, was the only one that was actually able to deliver and have something not as equally as cool, but something just as badass happen in their finale with Cersei blowing up the Sept, right, in that episode. And then I actually remember kind of liking the whole the last episode of season 5, right, with Cersei's Walk of Penance, and then with Jon obviously getting killed by the rest of the Night's Watch members, because at the time, that was where they caught up with the books. And at the time, we were all kind of wondering, like, oh shit, this is the last thing that happens in Dance of Dragons, which at the time it still is the last book. Like, what happens from here, you know? And that's kind of what made the anticipation for episode 6 build up even more. But the thing that I like particularly about this episode, Baelor, right, and why I personally think that outside of Ned Stark's death, the episode itself is a really, really solid episode, and I personally think is still one of Game of Thrones' best overall, is because you definitely get this sense where it's like all of the major characters that we've kind of been following have kind of hit this crux on their journey, right? Robb and Kat have a lot to do. Tyrion has a lot to do in this episode. Dany has a huge moment in this episode. Jon, even though Jon's moments in this episode kind of seem minimalistic compared to previous episodes, right? Jon, the more and more I'm seeing, Jon really doesn't have that much to do in this first season at the very least. But even he has this.
But like, Dom, like, you know, you're bringing up Jon, and of course, I'm going to have to jump in and just say, you know, revealing that the Maester at the wall is a Targaryen.
Is a Targaryen.
And that he basically chose that life, you know, it fits into the backstory, right? The Mad King and the Kingslayer and all this, and it's like, didn't they murder the whole family? But
Yeah.
here he is alive, duty bound to the wall, and sets up that parallel between him and Jon Snow.
Yeah.
And the fact is, like, Jon Snow is like, oh man, I got to go fight with Robb, and I got to go save Ned, and I got to go do this. And it's like, F this oaf type of attitude where he's willing to, forsake his, the honor that he swore to. And the Targaryen basically is like, listen, I could have done the same thing, but I chose to stay here and I live with it my whole entire life. And you got to do the same thing. And I'm not going to tell you what to do, but go ahead and do it. And I think that reveal here in this episode is very fantastic. And even though Jon seems to kind of play a very small role, in this season, like you say, like it's like him getting to the wall, him meeting these new characters, him sort of, meeting his new brothers and fitting in and getting a new family and really still trying to find his place by the end of the season. It basically sets him up for a big part in season 2 and in the series in general, going throughout the rest of the seasons.
Yeah, it's a monumental reveal when obviously Maester Aemon reveals that he is kind of, at least at the time, the last Targaryen, right? This is the moment where I love this parallel. I loved reading this moment in the books. I absolutely loved seeing it on screen. The actor who portrays him, I believe the actor's name is Peter Vaughn. He passed away a couple of years ago because, he was old. But that moment right there was just spectacular. Right? And he kind of sets up a lot of lines that end up becoming bastardized later on by the final season, where he does the whole love is the death of duty. And he brings up a lot of great parallels there when it's like, what is duty and honor compared to, having a wife and a kid and someone to love, as far as that goes. And he kind of brings up this interesting parallel by asking what would Ned do in this scenario if he had to pick and choose between the love of his family and the duty and honor. And Jon kind of says he would do whatever's right. And he says that Ned Stark is one man in 10,000, which obviously we'll see how that bodes for him this episode. But it kind of sets up.
I think Ned Stark, right? We know what type of person he is,
right,
in the opening scene of this episode, right?
Yeah.
Varys goes into the cell once again and starts telling this story about how I traveled with some actors and they taught me that all the world's a stage. Basically they taught him Shakespeare, even though that doesn't necessarily exist in this world, but pretty much that's what they taught him. And basically he's become a master actor, and Ned tells him, like, that's great, you've learned your craft, you're able to do that, you are the master of whispers and you're a great actor, but I learned to die a long time ago. I'm a soldier, and honor and duty and whatnot, that is what I've learned. And so we know that Ned, from that basically awesome conversation at the beginning of this episode, we know that Ned is honor bound, and that this is sort of what he's learned, what he's done his whole life, and it's not going to change. And the fact is, his last lesson is going to be, maybe you should never change who you are, because it didn't really work for him in the end.
Yeah, ultimately I think that even though Ned doesn't have that much to actually do in this episode, I think his presence still kind of looms large as like the last vestiges of the first season before we kind of get into the Game of Thrones that we all kind of know that dominated seasons 2 through 4 really, which is that the tragic thing about Ned's death and kind of how it's so brilliantly set up by this opening scene is that ultimately, at the end of the day, right, Ned's all about honor, right? He's going to his grave. He knows he's going to die at this point. He knows there's pretty much nothing that he can do. Varys won't help him. No one's going to help him at this point. And so his whole thing is, okay, at the very least, I have my honor. And the problem is that at the end of the day, they even find a way to strip that from him, because Varys tells him, hey, obviously if you do this deal, if you renounce your treachery and you state that Joffrey is the true king, then, you'll be sent off to the wall and be spared. And he's like, yeah, I don't care about that. You think my life is some precious thing to me? You want me to serve Cersei after everything she did? And then Varys brings up, obviously, the trump card that is Sansa, which is where, yeah, okay, fine. If you won't play ball, then we're going to have a Stark head to decorate these pikes somewhat. And if it's not yours, then it'll be your daughter's. And
yeah, I think, the fact is Ned never really played the Game of Thrones.
Right.
And Varys is telling him, like, this is how you play it. At this point, this is what you got to do to survive the game. And it's like, yes, you could die, but we don't want you to do that because, I think it's like even Cersei knows that a tame wolf is better than a dead wolf.
Yeah. Well, also, as it's revealed later on, it's the fact that they kind of need him because they figure that if they can keep him alive, right, at the very least, put him at the wall where he's no threat to anyone, that'll at least placate the Starks and the River Lords so that they could deal with Robert's brothers who are also worrying them just as much. If not more than that.
I think this is one of the most interesting things of this episode is that Ned doesn't know how to play the game, and Varys is teaching him how to play it, even, up to what could be his final moment. And, we are led to believe that he could actually escape this, and he's going to go and maybe join Jon and be part of the Night's Watch. And we can actually just, hope for one episode, for 50 minutes, we can hope that Ned has one more chance. And then, he comes across someone else that doesn't know how to play the Game of Thrones, but he's sitting on that throne, and that's Joffrey. Yep. And Joffrey basically doesn't care about Cersei's plans or the Lannister plan. He basically decides,
just
off
does
with
what he
his
wants.
head, I'm going to be a cruel king. You go against me, and I'm not going to show you any mercy. And he has this like childish view that being a cruel king and having people fear him, that's going to be what builds his legacy. But what he doesn't realize is that that's not really building the fear. That's instilling a hatred in the people.
Exactly. And we see that build up in the next season.
Exactly. And it's there's a difference between Tywin Lannister and how he builds fear and basically what Joffrey's sort of weird interpreted sense of that is. And Joffrey really doesn't know how to play the Game of Thrones. And it's said multiple times, in the next season, for sure, if I remember correctly, and I think I do, that Joffrey is sort of not a good king, and no one likes him.
To say the least.
Yeah, it's from what I remember, Joffrey basically is, seen as the worst king the kingdoms
So, what is it?
had.
Tyrion says we've had stupid kings and we've had crazy kings, but I don't think we've ever had anything as bad as a crazy idiot king or something like that. Right before he belts him in the face.
We'll get there when we see it.
We'll get there when we get there. But no, to bounce off your point about Joffrey, though, you're 100% dead on with that. Where you're right. Where again, the two people in this episode who don't know how to play are Ned and Joffrey, and the minute that Ned starts playing and finally kowtowing, that's when Joffrey strikes. And that's when Joffrey, again, makes the decision ultimately that just a petulant child does, which is that he ultimately just wants to be the center of attention. He wants to be feared, ultimately. And it also doesn't help that he's kind of a little bit of a psychopath, but he ultimately believes that in that moment that all he wants to do is see Ned's head on a spike with no foresight as to what that's going to bring. And we see in the next couple episodes, like even Tywin says, like madness and stupidity. But before we get into Ned Stark, I wanted to cover the other, so we covered Jon, we covered like a little bit of the beginning of Ned, but I wanted to cover a couple other big characters that really kind of hit their crux and their apex in this episode, and that's Tyrion, Robb, and Dany. So
let's talk about Tyrion, because Tyrion definitely knows how to play the game.
Yes.
And he's going to basically show us more and more as time goes on how that happens. And I will say it's just an observation I've made, watching this episode again, is that, this series shows you like people that are failing to play the game, and they end up sort of, being the ones that don't really make it. And another case in point, I think, is we're going to see that in Robb. We're going to see that in Joffrey for sure. And they don't really have great opportunities of making it that long in this series. But, in this episode, what's Tyrion up to? For the most part, I think he's about to go to battle, and he meets
the funniest part,
new.
This is the first example of season 1's limitation preventing them from actually showing the battle. Obviously, that would become famous for Game of Thrones. And they literally do, and they do of course the fake out where Tyrion gets knocked out right before the fight. And then afterwards it's revealed that it was all a trick, obviously, that Robb played on them. A very clever trick where he obviously, if you remember from the last episode, right, the whole thing is Robb sent the spy back to Tywin's camp saying that all 20,000 men were coming for Tywin, when in reality that did not happen at all. Robb only sent 2,000 of his men to die at Tywin's feet, while in the meantime he took his other 18,000 men, attacked Jaime's forces, and caught them off guard, so much so that they actually are successfully able to capture Jaime as well, which is actually a pretty cool moment. It shows that Robb is not just a kid. Robb knows what he's doing when it comes to battle.
It makes Robb a really substantial increase in value of his character.
Yes,
but I will say that it's really well done. I think the whole idea that he's going to be part of the vanguard, Tyrion, and he's going to march into battle, and then he gets knocked out because of his height. It's a little bit humorous. It's one of those things where it allows them to skip the battle.
Yeah, I don't remember if it happened exactly that same way in the books, but I don't think it was. It was definitely played up way more so for laughs in this episode
for sure.
than I feel like it was.
And we can argue whether or not making fun of someone with basically a genetic disorder, I guess, or genetics in general, whatever. But for the most part, that's part of Tyrion's character, is embracing that. So I think the fact is the show can have a little fun with that. But for the most part, I will say that, he gets knocked out. It's well done. But then all of a sudden it's fade back in. They have Jaime Lannister in chains. And it's oh man, I kind of wish I saw a battle.
Kind of wish you'd seen that, but again, I'm chalking that up to the season 1 limitations, right? And obviously the whole
it's understandable for sure,
right?
But it's also one of those things. Looking back, it's oh man, I wish they just sort of were able to go for it. Show us a little bit of a battle, even if it's limited. I feel like it feels like you're cheated as a fan. Although it is well done, so they get away with it. So it's I'm on the fence.
Yeah, it is well done. And the whole delivery of Tywin basically kind of revealing Robb's plan to Tyrion, and Tyrion is putting the pieces together, and then cut to the next scene where Robb's forces ride up and they have Jaime in chains. I think it's still exceptionally well done, and it's part of the reason why. Two other things, though, why I love this episode, but two other things.
Because Shay shows up. That's one of those reasons, right, Tom? It better be.
This is the introduction of two characters that end up going on to play a major role going forward. One in Tyrion's camp, one in Robb's camp. And Tyrion, yes, this is the introduction to Shay, the prostitute who becomes Tyrion's lover, at least for the next couple of seasons. And it's so weird because this is one of those things where I don't know exactly how much they differentiated for the books, but as far as kind of how they ended it, but it becomes imminently clear to me that they're trying to play Shay up. And I recognize this the minute that I started watching the show immediately. That this is something that I needed to take a long time to kind of be clued in on, which is the fact that the Shay in the books is the first character that I really got the sense of, oh, okay, this is a much different character that we're getting to know on screen that we did in the books, because in the books, she's played up as much more mysterious and vague, and you don't really know where her loyalties lie. And the whole thing is, again, because it's so one-sided through Tyrion's point of view, you don't really know where kind of her allegiances lie until obviously the turn in season 4 when Tywin brings her in to testify against him, and it's revealed that her loyalties lie to herself. But they kind of changed that in the show, and I honestly don't know how well it works. Where the whole thing that they do in the show is that it's the first of a couple romantic subplots that they change heavily from the show. I can tell Martin is not a guy that's very big on romance in general. I think that's kind of part of the reason why I gravitated towards these, because romance is always just an element in general that I freaking hate in storytelling. I don't know why. I guess I'm just kind of messed up like that. But Shay is played up as kind of this very sympathetic character who feels like she actually is growing a genuine connection to Tyrion, right? And you see that happen, obviously, when first with the drinking game, when Tyrion tries to find out more about her backstory, and she is very clamped down. It's no, you are not finding out anything about me. And then Tyrion goes kind of into the story, about, his first wife and everything, and kind of the tragedy that befell there, where obviously him and Jaime ended up rescuing this woman from bandits that he ended up marrying, and then it later was revealed that it was all just a hideous ploy, and that Jaime had actually hired a prostitute in order to pose as this woman for Tyrion to, pop his cherry, if you will, before ultimately Tywin does one of the most despicable things I think a father can ever do, which is where he literally has his knights rape this woman in front of Tyrion. It's one of the most traumatic things I feel like a person could go through, right? I feel like the only thing that's worse than sexual assault itself is witnessing someone that you care about, or at least that you thought you care about, go through said sexual assault. And it almost seems to generate this connection between the two of them that goes, it seems further beyond and beyond, but in a weird way, I don't necessarily know if it works in the long term, because again, because the way that they try to build it up is that part of the motivation why she testifies against Tyrion later on in his trial in season 4 is that he kind of breaks her heart and tries to play it up that he doesn't really care for her, and it kind of just gets muddled, and I don't necessarily really know if it works. Versus the whole thing that kind of made it work better, I feel like, in the books is that you never, even when it seemed like they were at their best, you never knew where her loyalties lied. And that's what kind of, it didn't make it shocking per se, but it made, I'll say, more sense in the books.
Yeah, no, it could be one of those things like the translation in the television, because for the most part, you're seeing the character's actions and you're seeing what Shay's doing, and you either have to, it's hard to be mysterious, you know, in that medium. You sort of have to pick a side, like, is she truly devoted or truly not? And then you could always switch that or change motivations later on, but you're seeing actions. So if basically Shay is acting mysterious, it's going to be like, oh, well, she's going to betray him. You know, it becomes obvious that that's what she's doing.
Right.
But if she's actually, you know, into him and sort of doing that, so I think it's just a way that the television has to be portrayed, because if she is too mysterious, it's going to be like, okay, well, instantly we know a betrayal moment's going to happen. And this show is all about sort of hiding those moments there together. You know, I think, you know, Tyrion basically does have this like tragic, you know, past in terms of romance, and it kind of, you know, continues in this show, but also like this storyline of you know, his whole first love, and you know, the whole idea, you know, that basically they get married even if it's not like a full, you know, fledged real marriage, and then you know, the guards are sort of ordered to you know, attack this woman. It's one of those things where I feel like that story, you know, is just something that is in Tyrion's past. And I feel like at some point, you know, obviously when we get to Sansa and Reek, you know, later on, that's something that's visually realized within the show. And it truly is a gruesome moment in the series. Yeah. And so it's interesting to see like a very similar tale be told and spun in this episode that brings a lot of characterization into Tyrion. It also brings characterization because Bronn and Shay are there to sort of listen to this story, and we get to see what their reactions are and how they sort of respond to what Tyrion is telling them, because this is sort of like two people that he's actually revealing himself to. And Tyrion, you know, usually is really the smart one, right? He's seen as the one that is best suited to play the Game of Thrones. But here he is with, you know, a sword for hire and basically, I guess, you know,
a prostitute. You call it what it is. She's a prostitute.
Yeah, I was going to say a woman for hire, but you know, be a little less on the nose.
I was about to say, I'm like,
but you know, basically, he's telling them, you know, his sort of innermost secrets, and it's strange to see that Tyrion, this lord who is going to become, you know, throughout the next season, in his own right, a very you know, very good strategist who has a mind for logistics and stuff like that. He's basically feels most comfortable with sort of, I guess, for lack of a better term, mercenaries.
Yeah. It's kind of the thing about Tyrion, right? Is that even though he's this highborn lord, because of kind of his, you know, birth defect, obviously, as we see, he's always felt this kind of more so gravitation towards, you know, the lowborns of the realm, right? He gravitates towards sellswords and cutthroats. He was able to gain the loyalty of the hill tribesmen, even going forward, right? He has always felt more at home with people of that rank, right? I guess that's why it's not necessarily a surprise, but it's kind of, I feel like, rewarding when in the next season he's all of a sudden placed in this position of power. And not only does he do really well, he almost single-handedly pretty much saves the city. Like, he even says that at multiple times after season 2, and he's kind of right as far as that goes, where it's like, yeah, I saved this whole city, and for what? You know, and it's kind of plays a big part in kind of his turn later on once he realizes that, like, yeah, he's playing for the wrong team by continuing to back his family. But
yeah, I definitely correct you here. I don't know if it's necessarily would be considered a birth defect. It is in this world. Like, everybody kind of looks at him wrong, but I think that's just the way he is.
Right.
So, but you know, it's two different perspectives, right? The way that we look at it in the real world versus the way that the story world looks at it.
Right.
But yeah, it's Tyrion is one of those characters characters that sort of understands the world, understands the motivations of, you know, the lords and knights and all those people, and he's able to sort of pull some of those strings, and he seems really good at it. Although, you know, he's not necessarily going to be able to outwit everybody. He is going to have to eventually, you know, flee and find Dany and basically try to, you know, consult her in terms of, you know, logistics and strategy and whatnot. As, you know, if we've seen the series, we know that that's the direction he takes. So, you know, it's one of those things where I think this is again, planting the seeds for the next season, you know, basically just getting him into this position of eventually going and becoming the Hand of the King. I think that gets sort of announced next week in the final episode. And basically that's what season 2 is all about. So,
yep.
You know,
and it's got single-handedly probably my favorite, not Tyrion moment, because I still think some of my favorite moments from him, just acting-wise, from Dinklage come in season 4. But I still think that, like, kind of my favorite Tyrion sub-arc, like, kind of, for me, when Tyrion was at his best, is in this upcoming season 2. There's one other thing that I wanted to cover before we hit Dany, and then we hit, obviously, poor old dead Ned, which is we get another introduction, an important introduction, even though it doesn't seem very important at the moment, on the Robb side of camp, before he obviously undergoes the whole trickery with Tywin and Jaime's forces, where they find themselves at this famous castle called the Twins, in the Riverlands, that they have to cross, because the Twins is the only castle. And the reason why it's called the Twins is because it's these separate towers on either side of this river, the Trident, that are connected by this one drawbridge. And they're the only ones, really, for miles where they can cross. So... Yeah. We get the introduction, obviously, to
the creepiest family.
The creepiest, just the weirdest family. Honestly, Arya
is
really
that even
did.
True? You can even say that, or are there some competitors?
There are, but none that are coming to mind right now. So yeah, let's get to it. Walder Frey, portrayed by David Bradley, and I believe the second of a couple of Harry Potter crossovers into Game of Thrones, right? The first obviously being Osha. Osha, the actress who plays Osha, is Natalia Tena, who famously portrayed the character of Nymphadora Tonks in the last couple of Harry Potter movies. But I remember the big thing, right, is when I saw the clips of this show on YouTube before I actually started watching it, and I'm like, oh shit, Argus Filch from Harry Potter is in this. And it makes sense, because where Filch, as the character, is kind of laughed at and treated as a joke because of how horrible and despicable he is, the show is almost kind of doing this weird meta commentary on, oh, what if Argus Filch were put in charge of everything? And this is kind of the result, where you get this 90-year-old, super old, super cranky, super weird, super creepy dude that basically, like, marries women that are, like, multiple generations younger than him, basically kind of plays by his own rules, right? The whole thing about Walder Frey's reputation is that Walder Frey is kind of only loyal to himself. He's famously earned the nickname the Late Walder Frey by kind of waiting to show up at the Battle of the Trident during Robert's Rebellion until the battle had already been won, in order to kind of try and decide, okay, whose side am I going to fight for? Am I going to fight for Robert's side, or am I going to fight for the crown, obviously? So Walder Frey is kind of set up here as being this super not trustworthy person, but the problem is that, like everyone else in Westeros that you come to find out, these characters are some of the most despicable people that you'll ever meet, but they need them.
Well, Dom, they're so untrustworthy that the fact is he keeps, like, taking younger and younger wives, having different children, like bastards, and
he's got like at least 80 children just to his name. It's ridiculous.
He just, is basically sleeping with everybody. It doesn't matter. Like, that's how he's abusing his power to that point. And then, he is so untrusted that he cannot marry off any of these children. Like, no one wants to enter his family.
Yes.
No one wants to take any of those sons and daughters away from his keep. And it's one of those things where he basically complains and wishes he can get rid of those children. And I see in the chat, like, Eric is talking about the Boltons being pretty creepy, and it's like I definitely agree. You know, it's
the Boltons do come close. Yes,
Ramsay does a couple of sadistic things, specifically to Theon.
Yes,
to the point where Theon gets a name change to Reek. So I think. Yeah, I think the Boltons are probably the most sadistic, which I guess falls into creepy. But I think, the Freys are just plain creepy. Like, not like dangerous, but creepy. So I think the Boltons are more of a dangerous, sort of scary family. And I would say, like, creepy, like, oh, those people are kind of weird. That's when I say creepy, I think that's what I mean.
Yeah, friggin', it's literally to the point where Robb is more pissed that he has to marry this one girl than it is like him like having to pledge fealty to Frey and everything. Because the problem is they need Frey's forces ultimately at the end of the day, is that the Freys do command like the second biggest host of soldiers in the Riverlands, right? And the whole thing is obviously he needs the combination. This is ultimately
Robb's mistake, right? Like,
yes.
Oh yeah, I'll agree to it. And it's he's he wants to cross that bridge, and he agrees to anything, and he doesn't actually realize
what he's signing up for, and it comes back to
he doesn't understand the long game. And it's not like this episode shows you that,
right?
But it sets it up, and it gets explored in the next season or two. How Robb is really good at war, really good at tactics, is sort of basically looking good in terms of a ruler, but he's going to suffer some of the same issues that Ned has, which come down to learning how to play the game.
I think it's ironic that in the same episode that Ned dies for not knowing how to play in the game, Robb is already setting himself up for his own demise with kind of this deal with the devil that they're forced to make, obviously, with the Freys. Obviously, Kat's the one that goes into the castle in order to make the deal, thinking that, the fact that she'd known Walder Frey since she was a girl, that this will give her some sort of protection. And we clearly see that it's like, if Walder Frey knows, and he makes it very clear within our interaction
Catelyn
with him.
Stark's father already dead at this point?
No, not yet. Her father, Hoster Tully, is not dead yet, but even though it's not mentioned in the books until in the show until season 3, in the books it is made clear that like he is very, very sick and like close to death at this point.
All right, because that's you swear allegiance to him, my father, but yet he's not really present in the series, so it's one of those things where very easily we can see that Walder Frey is not going to basically uphold that allegiance.
Yeah, once again, kind of reinforcing this idea that kind of, again, the kind of the deconstruction of all of these like kind of fantasy and fairy tale kind of tropes that we've learned over the years of our adolescence. So it's like, all these holy oaths and all these noble knights, all of that is complete bullshit. All of that is complete and utter bullshit. And when the chips are down, it's ultimately who's left standing. And that's who matters at the end of the day. And Walder Frey, I feel like, is another reminder of that the Starks just keep missing ultimately. Now, the other big, obviously kind of crux and apex, if you will, that happened to this episode before we get to poor old dead Ned. I still love Jaime's coinage of that phrase. It's fantastic. Is Daenerys and everything that she goes through, where she's quite literally at a breaking point here. Khal Drogo can't ride his horse. His wound is festered to the point where he'll be dead in a little bit. The Khalasar is already kind of looking beyond because they say that Drogo
basically again this storyline is just it's nonsense to me. But for the most part, like we said earlier, the horde leaves. And then they set up this tent and they allow the witch to go in there. And
it's ridiculous.
She proposes like, I know some magic and I'll do some magic. And, it's like, bring me his horse. And they lead you to believe that they're going to sacrifice the horse. But then the one guy goes in to kill the witch and Drogo, and Mormont stops him. And, but before that, the guy punches Khaleesi in the stomach, and then Mormont has to avenge her, and it's just like this sloppiness that I don't like. And eventually, she gets brought into the tent because apparently the witch not only knows how to do like a spell to bring Drogo back, but is going to be doing that spell, killing a horse, and also delivering Dany's son at the same time. And it's like, you don't think there's going to... It's like Ghostbusters 2.
It's
Don't cross
what
the
are you doing?
streams.
think
They're crossing the streams. It's like the child is going to be gone. You're like...
It's like, I think the only kind of leeway that I'm willing to throw Daenerys, because you're right, kind of the crux of this is nonsense. And like the whole point of the end of season 1 when it ends is that it's supposed to be the characters who are severely affected are the ones who kind of don't learn their lessons and don't see the writing on the wall and kind of end up, suffering for that the most. And even though Daenerys doesn't lose her life the way that Ned does, she still kind of discovers that she kind of has a lot to learn, because at the midpoint, like literally just a couple of episodes ago, she was married to this great Cal, leading this great army, and she was on this righteous quest to take back her father's throne. And then not only is all of that taken away from her within like a heartbeat, but also it's the fact that she learns that she kind of trusted the wrong people. And we'll talk about this more, because Daenerys, we're going to talk about a lot in the next episode, because I feel like she is kind of a big focus. I feel like kind of the seeds, I still am of this opinion that even though it was botched in the show, I do actually still buy into the idea that Daenerys does end up going bad. Because the seeds, looking back, are planted here. Where in the next episode, she has this conversation with Mirri Maz Duur about how she saved her, and Mirri Maz Duur kind of reminds her, it's like, look who you were leading. Look what the Dothraki did. Look what the Dothraki are gonna do. I kind of did the world a favor as far as that goes, And Dany is kind of so blindsided by everything that she's done that she doesn't actually realize what it is that she's saying. And that's something that kind of follows Dany throughout the rest of the show, because even though Dany considers herself to be on this righteous quest to free everyone, she doesn't realize kind of the means through which she's doing it. And the whole thing is that even though, again, it's completely botched, the dialogue is stupid, the way that it's set up is kind of moronic, but Tyrion did, I feel like, bring up a lot of valid points in that final episode when he was in jail talking to Jon, trying to coax him into doing what needed to be done by saying, yeah, everywhere she goes, evil men die, and we cheer her on. And it kind of gets into the whole... I like how, again, the whole interest of Game of Thrones has always been that there is no good and evil. It's only black and white and only different perspectives. And obviously, yeah, we're going to root for Dany when she's hanging like slavers and child rapists and murderers and some of the worst people known to man and freeing all these slaves. But we're so with her on the ride that we don't realize kind of the direction that she's going in until it's too late. And I think that if the last 2 seasons hadn't been rushed and they had been able to deliver that storyline the right way, I think we could have gotten something really, really interesting and something totally against the grain than anything we've ever gotten before. But obviously, we see the results of that. But I feel like all of the seeds are laid here, where, again, her whole mistake here is that she is kind of, obviously, besides the fact that, she's super disoriented from the fact that she is literally quite forcefully put into childbirth, but she kind of has been, in a weird way, almost like, I'll say it, almost Stockholmed into the Dothraki way of life, that she is just so willing to do anything that she can in order to save her Cal that she doesn't even realize that she's just dooming him more and more, and that the best case scenario would have been to follow Jorah's advice.
I will say that, the next episode of this season, the final episode, Jason Momoa goes, I won't say it, but Ben Stiller in Tropic Thunder says you should never do something fully. I think Jason Momoa, unfortunately, does that in the next episode. And it's one of those things where just like him laying there drooling and her crying, and it's the whole storyline. I don't like it at all. Like, it gets us from point A to point B, and I like the plot point, but it's just everything about it, like the whole him getting cut, and then it's like, oh, hey, let her, the person we were, basically just attacking, we killed, her whole family, destroyed her temple, it's like, we don't know how many people have already like sexually assaulted her. Like, yeah, let's seek medical advice from her, and let's keep doing it over several episodes. Let's let her do this sort of, magic trick, and try to bring the call back, by killing his horse and letting her also, try to bring Khaleesi's baby into the world at the same time. It's sort of all nonsense to me.
You know what it is? It screams kind of the same. Better. It screams kind of the same thing that happened with Robert Baratheon's death a couple episodes, where it kind of feels very rushed. and it doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of logic that goes into it, and it kind of just feels like, okay, this is just the thing that needs to happen in order to get Dany onto this next stage of her journey. And I'll agree, it's not handled as well.
Like, let's say, earlier in the season when Dany is still sort of learning to be the Khaleesi, they raid a village and they attack, and it like very early on, it's like her first, like, no, keep them alive. Or like maybe they're around and they're being mistreated and she doesn't say anything. And then a few episodes later, when she finally gets her power and her brother's killed and she feels fully confident, that's when she finally notices them and sort of frees them. That way it's like, the line of like, oh, how many people assaulted us before you stopped them? Like it would actually have impact, that sentence, because we would have seen them get captured, like let's say episode 4 or whatever. And here it is, episode 9, 10, and we're being told this. And that character is sort of a character that's lingering around, not just some extra that got, upgraded to a full blown actor, on the day of, that's what it feels like to me. I know they probably planned this out. They probably hired, this particular actor to
who does great witch in the role, by the way. I do. Exactly. Even she's only got 3 episodes, but the actress who plays Miri Maz-Dur, I looked up her name on Amazon and I can't remember, and I'm really mad. But she does a pretty solid job with her little arc.
Yeah, I don't want to dismiss what was brought to the role, but for the most part, it's like it just could have been a bigger part throughout the entire season. And that actor would have pulled it off for sure. But I just think it was too short, too sweet. And basically, it's just one of those things where it happened. I understand the plot points. I just felt like it was probably the weakest.
There's not a whole lot of thought that it goes into. Yeah, I agree. And
like Khal Drogo had to die.
Khal Drogo did have to die. Well, that is the one thing that became very
100%. For sure. Yes. But it just could have been a little more like Game of Thrones-ish, like a big reveal. It's sort of like he gets cut. Oh, yeah,
this happened.
He gets cut, and then it's like, oh, let's let her do the medical treatment. It's like, you've never heard of poison. Wait, yes, you did, because we brought it up 2 episodes ago. Yeah, when the merchant tried to poison her.
An episode ago. That was 1 episode before.
Yeah, so it's like, why do you not think that a villager whose village was just destroyed is not going to try to poison this great leader? That all of a sudden, like, she's going to play by the rules and be like, I'll heal you.
Again, it's the same mistake that Dany made that Ned Stark made, which is trusting in people's overall better nature rather than, again, just seeing the writing on the wall.
Yeah,
and
but
seeing
like
the common
that
sense.
parallel's not really made. But anyway, the fact that you're bringing up Ned Stark means it's that time.
Let's get into it. Focus character
time.
Because time to talk about Ned.
The only thing about Ned Stark is Jon, gets that sword. From the Lord Commander. We didn't mention that, and it's not necessarily important to this episode, but it's a thank you for basically saving the Lord Commander's life from the zombie people in the previous episode. And I figured I would just bring that up because that is sort of Jon did the honorable thing and saved his life, and now Mormont, the Lord Commander, is returning that favor by giving the sword that was meant for his son to Jon, which is a big deal, and it shows that people like Ned Stark do exist elsewhere in the realm, and one specifically is the current Lord Commander at the Wall.
Yes.
So, I think that's very important to see that in this episode, that Ned Stark is not like the last of the Mohicans, so to speak, to bring up that story, the leather stocking tales. But for the most part, there are other honorable people out there, and we know of them. And, here it is, Ned Stark about to see if he can continue playing the Game of Thrones or not. What do you think, Dom?
Yeah, it's, what it is? It's the fact. So I knew this was coming in the first episode, obviously, because, again, I'd read the books. This was not something that was a big shocker to me as the way that it was to everyone else, right? Like, I still remember everyone just going nuts, right? And
yeah, I went nuts. Like I said, I started watching this show because I was sick, and my brother was like, hey, you'll get through your sickness if you binge watch this. And so, I watched all 9 episodes. I did predict within 1 second that Bran was going to be pushed off the tower in that opening episode. As soon as I saw him put a hand on the wall and start climbing, I was like, yeah, he's falling.
He's gone.
But
he's gone.
Yeah, Ned Stark, I did not see being executed by the end of this season. So it's maybe I was a little sick, so I didn't have my I had my blinders on, so to speak. But it was sort of a big shocking moment for me.
You know what the thing is that kind of makes Ned's death more of a surprise, really, I feel like, than certain other surprise deaths that come in, like Robb or Tywin at the end of season 4, or any of the other kind of surprise deaths that come in, is that Ned is given every single possible chance right back in the first episode to not go for it. First, he could have denied Robert and said that he's going to stay in Winterfell, but he doesn't listen, and he goes south to Winterfell. And he goes south to King's Landing.
I can't do it, Catelyn. I can't. Right? Isn't that what he says?
Something like that. And then he's given every single possible hint. This is not the place for you. You need to pay more attention. You need to watch your back. You need to watch who you're calling your friends. And he trusts Littlefinger, the most untrustworthy of everyone.
Littlefinger tells him what to do, and then he says,
Littlefinger does tell him what to do, and he doesn't listen. You're right.
And then Littlefinger's like, "Oh, you won't do that? Well, okay, I'll help you." Yeah. And it's like, what?
It's like, what?
It's like, dude. He literally, the episode before that said, the smartest thing you did was not trust me.
Not trust me.
And now you're going to trust him.
It's like, come on, dude. And then he finds out the truth. And then he decides to make his play on the Lannisters in the absolute worst way possible. Not with people who would actually be loyal to him, but with the City Watch who are paid for. I mean, first things first, I feel like it's just common courtesy. You never trust paid soldiers when your guys are outnumbered. It's just terribly stupid as far as that goes. And then, of course, he's inevitably betrayed. He sits in a dungeon for a couple of episodes. And then we have the final thing from Varys kind of acting as the messenger and the emissary from Cersei to him, which is basically telling him, it's like, okay, You want to die? Okay, cool, but your daughters are going to die as well, and who do you care about more? And that's finally what gets Ned to crack. That's what makes him renounce his precious honor.
I think it's the family thing, but I think it's also Varys's plea for serve the realm. This is what's needed for the realm. And I think that sort of ties into Ned Stark's honor system. And so the fact is it's the honorable thing to do is to serve the realm. And I think that's one of the reasons, even though we might not necessarily see it fully come to realization on screen, but I think the reason why Ned gets up in front of everybody and sort of declares himself a traitor is part family, part the fact that he thinks he's doing the honorable thing by serving the realm. And I think from an audience point of view, if we're looking at the subtext here, by the end of this episode, we're like, oh, damn, the realm's in trouble.
Yeah, to say the least. And I feel like to kind of tie this in with the point that you made in the first episode that we did, obviously kind of Ned's whole defining arc that is set up obviously is he's the last person that kind of adheres to oaths, right? He doesn't care that what the Night's Watch member is trying to say to him, right? He knows that that he broke the law, therefore this is what has to go. And it's kind of that strict adherence to oaths that in a weird way gets him killed in the exact same way that he killed the Night's Watch members with his own sword, to say the least, obviously, because they use his great sword, Ice, made of Valyrian steel. The executioner, Ilan Payne, chops off his head right there. And it's kind of fascinating kind of seeing that full circle and kind of seeing, of all the things that are kind of set up and then kind of abandoned as the show goes on, that one thing that was set up and carried through to a T. And Martin completely nailed that both in the books and in the show overall. And I guess the one instance where I'm like, okay, guys, you were really this surprised by that is the fact that Ned Stark is played by Sean Bean. And Sean Bean obviously has a long, long history of dying in every single movie that he's in, obviously, because he played a bunch of different villains throughout the 90s and throughout the 2000s, obviously, and because he'd already had a precedent of having this iconic death in another fantasy property, obviously, with the way that he dies at the end of the first Lord of the Rings movie. So I guess that's the other reason, too, why I'm not as surprised, because it's guys, it's Sean Bean, come on. But that's that doesn't have to do with the story. That has to do with kind of outside of the realm of things. But
do you think Sean Bean's agent was hey man, social media is starting to go on fire, and there's this meme culture, and like, I got this script. I think if you do this, if you play Ned Stark, you're gonna be a popular meme.
I think that.
Do you think that was sort of like in the decision making?
The ironic thing,
why he chose this role.
The ironic thing being that that's not even Sean Bean's most popular meme. The most popular meme that he's involved with is the one does not simply scene from Fellowship. That's the most popular meme. I remember that was like one of the first big memes that I saw. And I definitely think there was something where after a certain point, after like almost damn near 20 years of working in this industry, because that's the other thing too, Sean Bean is pretty old. Sean Bean is like in his mid-60s now. Like he's not a spring chicken as far as that goes.
I think he played into this for sure because
absolutely.
I think it was Hitman 2 recently, the last couple of years, the video game series. There was a special sort of elusive target, which you can only do once. You can only do the mission once. And Sean Bean plays a character where you have to go into this and basically he's the target and you have to eliminate him. And so it's one of those things where like Game of Thrones definitely blew up this whole idea. Like he always dies, he always whatever, put it in the zeitgeist, front and center, going forward. And then he's capitalized on it, becoming
Absolutely.
a model, like a polygon model.
Yeah. And the ironic thing is that in a lot of the movies that he's done recently after Game of Thrones, that was like his last big major character death, because a lot of the movies that he did after that, he didn't die in. Famously, obviously, I think he was in like 3 different movies in 2015. Only one of which were good, and the big talking point was that he didn't die in any one of them. He played a part in that the most recent Wachowski's movie that came out, Jupiter Ascending. He was in The Martian, and then he had a quick bit part in that Adam Sandler movie that came out, the last theatrical Adam Sandler movie that came out, Pixels. And he didn't die in any one of them. And so that was the big talking point. But recently, he's been getting back into movies, and he was in David Cronenberg's Sons movie that came out last year, and he famously died in a very gruesome way in that. But at this point, it's definitely
what was
like
that movie again?
Possessor.
Oh yeah, Possessor. I always forget that name. I haven't seen the movie yet. But
I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I hear so much about it, and Cronenberg is definitely one of my faves. So I'm glad to hear Sean Bean's in it, because that means at least there's probably some other good actors in it.
There is, Andrea Riseborough and Christopher Abbott, I think, give really good performances. But the thing to keep in mind though about this movie is it's not actually Cronenberg; it's his son doing it.
Yeah. So, well, come on, They had to have some conversations, and Cronenberg is just one of those directors that brings the unexpected.
Yes, absolutely. So, unfortunately, as is quoted by Jaime in the next season, poor old dead Ned. Eric, to answer your question, his last truly iconic role, I don't know per se, but I definitely think that, like, obviously Sean Bean's getting up there in years, so the chances of him having kind of these iconic roles are slowly getting slimmer and slimmer and slimmer as time goes on, I'll definitely say. But the only other thing that I really have to add to this podcast before we get out of here is kind of the origin of the church, obviously, which is where Ned famously meets his end. Obviously, it's the title of the episode, Baelor, which is the great...
Like they don't really bring it up that much within the episode.
Not
right?
yet in this first
season. It's sort of like it happens there. But what is this thing? Like, what?
It plays a bigger part going forward, obviously, once we start to include kind of the religion of the Seven more so in the plot of the show, once we get into the High Sparrow and everything that goes on there between seasons 5 and 6 with Cersei. But the interesting thing I feel like about the history of this is the fact that it was built by Baelor the Blessed, who was known as this king who was so kind and so generous to the point where it killed him, where he literally starved himself to death because he was trying to, purge himself of sins. It's kind of this thing that Tywin brings up when he's giving Tommen this monologue in season 4, right after Joffrey dies, about what makes a good king, which is that you can be good, and who knows where it'll get you. You can be strong, and who knows where it'll get you, but being wise and being smart, but not just smart in the moment, smart in the long term, that kind of gets you and makes you the best king as far as that goes, learning strategy, learning the people that you're ruling, and so I feel like kind of, even though it's not expressly said, I feel like kind of the symbolism behind the existence of Baelor and the fact that that's where Ned meets his end, and obviously we see later on how kind of the idea of what the Seven is supposed to represent is heavily corrupted by the inclusion of the Sparrows and everything. But I think it's beautiful irony as far as that goes, where this place that is originally designed for peace and to be this place of worship and this place of sanctity for the people of King's Landing ends up being the site of this gruesome execution and the site of even more atrocities to come as the rest of the show goes on.
Awesome. It's one of those things where like it's very subtle in this season. It's almost like for me, like I was like, what Baelor? Why is this episode called this? And it went way over my head. And then we talked prior to the show, and it's like, oh, that totally makes sense. So yeah. I wonder, it's going to be interesting to track this as we watch the episodes as the seasons go forward. And because it's one of those things where it's very subtly done. And it's almost like I remember when we get to the part where sort of, you have the religious fanatics sort of take over King's Landing. It's like, this almost came out of nowhere. So it's very not.
Well, that was kind of the thing that I noticed about about every other season of Game of Thrones is that it kind of every 2 seasons they kind of do this weird reset, right? Where it's like at the end of season 4, obviously that's a huge moment, right? Tyrion kills Tywin, Dany banishes Jorah, Stannis arrives at the wall, and it kind of signifies that big changes are coming, right? And so the whole thing about the Sparrows is that, while yes, they do seem to come out of nowhere as far as the religious aspect goes, I think it's definitely built up as like, okay, now that Tywin's gone and kind of there's no one left to kind of restrain her, Cersei can kind of go unchecked, and we kind of, see what happens there. So I don't necessarily know if it comes out of nowhere, but I definitely see where you're coming from as far as that goes. So
yeah, I'm just saying it's very subtle. Obviously there's these elements that we can see here and there, and I think we'll see them as we watch these episodes. But for the most part, it's in this episode, it's very much just a place. Not much is said about it.
Yes, indeed. So let's read off some comments before we get out of here. Of course, Eric Thorpe being a trooper, showing up as always and commenting throughout. But we actually have a couple new guys in the chat as well. Darksteel Gaming commented, nice, looking forward to it. Thanks for all of the content lately, guys. Oh, thanks, man.
Yeah, and all that Fast and the Furious stuff, right, Tom?
Yeah, right? Oh, man.
The two of you, Christian and yourself, have been watching a lot of that stuff.
Oh, yes, we have. Yes, indeed, we have. And then we also have a guy, Scares Gamer Antigo, saying hello, my brother. Hello to you as well. Thank you again for tuning in. And Eric, of course, threw off a couple of, I thought, some pretty funny comments, quoting the Joker, obviously, famously from The Dark Knight, based off of my my Walder Frey comments before. When the chips are down, they'll eat each other. And see, I'm not a monster. I'm just ahead of the curb. Very, very clever, Eric. Very clever. And then his whole thing with the last 2 seasons. Yeah, the last 2 seasons were simply rushed, in my opinion. That's the only real issue. The plot threads were solid as fuck. Agree and disagree. I think there's a lot of plot threads that worked, that could have worked within the rushed story plotting. I think there's a lot of storylines that didn't. I still am not necessarily a fan of the whole going beyond the wall to grab a White Walker and bring that back to King's Landing. That whole thing, I'm still like, oh, okay, so this is what we're doing. But he had one other thing that I saw that I thought was actually, another funny comment where, in reference to my comment on Tywin advising Tommen, where he's like, didn't know how much good that advice did Tommen. And, well, the problem is that Tywin kind of died before he really had a chance to advise Tommen, and so he only had Cersei to advise him. As we came to learn, Tywin and Cersei rule very, very differently. But, yeah, he also brought up another point where he says, interesting how in The Winds of Winter, the episode where the series arguably comes full circle is when Baelor, the place where the main conflict begins, gets blown up. Interesting point. Definitely. That's another, I think, really good point as to how, this location comes to play, various important details throughout the series as it goes on. But, Pat, with the death count, too, before we get out of here, we only had another 2 deaths. Next week for the finale, what we're going to do is...
So Ned dies, and, like, the that one guy that goes to kill Khal Drogo.
Yes, Kotho is his name, too.
Oh, okay.
Yes, those are the only 2 deaths that happened in this episode.
Really?
That's it. There were no others.
Oh man, that's a pretty stark.
Well, I mean,
count.
all of the Lannister and Stark soldiers that died, obviously. What's it called? In the fields of battle. But again, like, well, our whole thing is, I think it's we're only
the
focusing,
fade out.
Yeah, during the fade in, fade out. Yeah, our whole thing is
2,000 people died, right?
Something
that
like
counts
that.
Towards
we're
the
only
body count?
talking about either named characters or one-on-one characters that have their deaths. So unfortunately, we will not be mourning all of the thousands of various soldiers that lost their lives in Blackwater and Battle of the Bastards and the Wall and all of those other battles that are forthcoming in the series. But with that being said, Pat, next week, I wanted to let people know in advance, we will still be putting up an episode, even on 4th of July. And next week is the Season 1 finale, officially, of Talkin Thrones. But just to let you guys know, who have faithfully been coming back and watching each and every week, we're going to be taking a break in between the finale of Season 1 and the beginning of Season 2. So the following week after next week, there will be no Talkin Thrones episode. On Sunday, we're taking a break. We both have something that's going on that weekend.
I think we're taking a break, basically next week and the week after. But next week, we're doing a pre-tape of the finale.
Yes, next week we are doing a pre-taped episode for the finale.
Definitely, well, I guess we could use that premiere feature. I don't know if you want to do that, Dom, but basically when that video goes live, post your comments there. We still want to hear what you think about Season 1, Episode 10. Yes. So,
the first
watch
season
it,
finale.
Drop some feedback, and we'll talk about it when we return.
Absolutely, yes. And once again, thank you guys for staying with us on this journey so far. Again, it's only going to soup up from here. So again, 2 weeks after the finale drops will be the premiere of Season 2 of Talkin Thrones. We don't know if we're going to do a break in between every season like we do this season. It just so happens that this season, just how it lined up with our recording dates, we ended up having something that weekend, so we weren't able to we didn't think that we were going to be able to find the time, so we figured that this would just be the best course of action. So once again, people, next week, pre-recorded, but still be sure to tune in and give us your thoughts. 2 weeks after that is when Season 2 commences ultimately. So thank you guys again for tuning in to another episode of Talkin Thrones. It's awesome still to have you guys here every week, and it makes me really happy, definitely, that I'm not the only one that still cares kind of about the future of this show. We're still going to be talking about a lot next week. We're going to be breaking down kind of all the deaths this season. We're going to be talking about kind of the legacy that Season 1 has for the rest of the show, right? And we're still going to be talking about a lot, obviously, next week for 4th of July. So make sure you get in your barbecues. Make sure, you go to your parties. Obviously, still continuing to stay safe and everything. And be sure to also tune into the next episode of Talkin Thrones next week. Pat, where can the good people find you on the interwebs?
Well, Dom, it's one of those things where you can catch me here at Talkin TV, right? I'm talking some Thrones with you, obviously, but also, if you want to check out my social media, I'm directing everyone towards my Instagram at Patrick W. Huber, and hey, it's one of those things. I will post something there someday, or I'll adopt some other account and tell you what that is. But that's the current one that I might use.
Awesome. Sounds good. And you can, of course, follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Movie Nerd Reviews, which is my personal page, but you can find me posting more on our official accounts for this podcast here, which is, of course, the Talkin TV podcast, at Talkin TV podcast on both Facebook and Instagram. And be sure to also, if you haven't already, click the subscribe button, click the like button, click the bell next to the subscribe button. That way you guys get notified every time we put up new content. And, of course, people, remember, be sure to tune in next week for the finale, 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies.
Kill more Starks. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That doesn't sound right.
We'll see you guys next time. Take care.
Later.